Now, our next topic comes in handy in those rare use cases where you have a machine that you need to build in a location that is perhaps far removed from the rest of your domain because of some latent network condition. Maybe you've got a slow connection. Maybe you've got a very full connection that you can't get traffic across within any reasonable amount of time. Now, when that's the case, it is entirely possible to build a domain controller in that remote location and use the US Postal Service or whatever your local postal service is in order to transfer the contents of the Active Directory database, perhaps on a flash drive, because sending it through the mail is faster than sending it through whatever network you have. This is called an install from media installation. And the process to do so starts by creating what is essentially a little mini snapshot of your Active Directory database on an existing domain controller. Let's go ahead here and bring up an elevated command prompt here that runs as administrator, because I want to show you the process that you would need to go through to create that initial snapshot. This snapshot will obviously be a little bit behind from the everyday changes in your Active Directory infrastructure, but will be a great starting point to allow that remote domain controller to at least get the large quantity of your Active Directory up and operational so that it only needs to replicate those things that have changed. The way in which we create the snapshot starts by launching the ntds.dit command, which is the ntds.dit command, which is the kind of the Swiss Army knife for your Active Directory database. ntds.dit has a large number of commands that you could potentially use here, many of which you'll talk about as you go through the rest of your exploration of the MCSA and MCSE. But the command we're looking for here has to do with creating an IFM instance. Let's start by focusing ntds.dit on the current copy of the Active Directory database that we're using in production. I will do that with activate instance ntds. That currently focuses us then on the running copy of Active Directory as opposed to any lightweight directory partitions that might be out there. Once we're done with that, we need to type in ifm to get us to the installation from media submenu. Now, this submenu comes with a variety of different tasks that we could do. The tool that we're interested in here, because we need all of these bits to create a new domain controller, would be create full and then a location where we want to store that IFM media. Also available here is the abilities to create an RODC if I'm creating a read-only domain controller, or just an output of the sysvol content as well. Let me go ahead and create this full here on C, users, G Shields, desktop, and then we'll call this IFM. That creates a snapshot, and this process takes just a second or two. The larger your database is, the longer it will take for it to create that snapshot. And then once we're done, we can take a look at the file that we just created, which should be, actually not here apparently, it should be found in C, users, and then G Shields, and then desktop. There's our IFM folder. In the IFM folder is a copy of the Active Directory and the registry entries that are important, and there is our ntds.dit file. If you've ever wondered where the Active Directory database exists, it actually exists in this file called ntds.dit. That's the database itself. Also, here are some registry values that we would need in order to get that other controller, that other domain controller, configured in the way we need to. Once I have that folder, I can take that folder and drop it onto a USB thumb drive, stick it in the mail, receive it at my remote location, and then once I'm at my remote location, if I flip over here to an example machine, I can then from that remote location use the information on that thumb drive to go about completing the process of creating a new domain controller. Now I've got here our server file1.company.pri, and I'm not going to go through installing Active Directory onto this machine because we have need for it later on. But I have gone as far as just to get the bits installed so that we can go about attempting to promote this server to a domain controller. Now in this case, again, we're not going to go through all the steps here, but I want to show you that when it comes time to add a new domain controller to an existing domain, and I provide in all the correct information, the domain and the credentials, and choose Next down here, this is the process I would go through in order to create a new domain controller using this IFM media. I will here, just as before, punch in a DSRM password. I'm going to leave it in the existing site, although arguably if I was in a remote site, I would need to punch in the remote site name here. Down here under Next, I would choose DNS options if I needed to, but down here under Additional Options is where I could go about choosing to install from media. And it's this location where I'd go about pointing it to that appropriate media on that thumb drive to gather and install the snapshot of the Active Directory database. Now, once the snapshot is installed, Obviously, that's a snapshot from a particular period of time. And so the domain controller that I'm creating is going to need to gather anything that's changed from the time that that snapshot was taken up until this moment in time. In order to get those changes, you'll want to point it towards probably the closest domain controller to the DC that you're creating. Now, normally it shows here any domain controller because in a well-connected environment, it doesn't really matter which domain controller you grab that information from. But when I'm dealing with a very slow network connection, I want to come down here and make sure that I do any replication from that machine that is geographically, or at least on the network, placed the closest to this machine. Once I'm done with that, I can go through all the steps that exist here in the wizard and add this as an additional domain controller.